Hi, I'm Peter Cowan, the Bee Whisperer. It's Wednesday, the 1st of February, and we are now starting to experience some winter after having had a very warm winter. We're about to experience some real brutal cold, and temperatures down into the minus 40s, minus 50s, minus 60s with the wind chill. It's going to be pretty darn cold. Fortunately, it's only going to be for a short while, but that's certainly enough to do the damage. I mean, that's like a blast freezer. And so it's very important that our hives are ready for this. There's a few simple precautions you can take if you're going to be experiencing this cold. Those of you in Maine and much of New England and the northern states, you have this every few years or so. Well, this is the time where we have to be ready for it. Fortunately, it's not going to be one of those spells which lasts for a week or so, which can kill bees for a whole different reason. So let's go into why is it that they're dying under these circumstances, and what can we do about it? When the real cold lasts for some time, the bees are locked into position. So let's picture what happens inside a beehive when it goes from about 32 degrees down to 0 degrees. We're talking Fahrenheit here. 32 degrees, the cluster in your beehive, which is about this big, your cluster gets down to, is down to this big. It only has to cover a certain amount of area. And it's covering a certain amount of comb, therefore covering a certain amount of honey. When it gets really cold, the bees have to tighten up and generate more heat. So the cluster is now covering a much smaller volume, a much smaller surface area of comb, much of which is comb where they've already eaten the honey near the center. So the cluster would be moving around as they ran out of honey, but once it's cold, it's going to be hard to, because they're going from that big down to this big, and that gap, this bit, the parts on the outside of that cluster, now that a lot of that honey's been eaten, so they may have difficulty moving from that spot. So if they're locked into this smaller area, they can starve to death. Often they're locked into that area because in the middle of this cluster, they've got some brood, and they will never leave that brood to die from cold. They'll stay there and starve to death rather than leave that brood alone. Now, with the warm spell we had in early mid-January, I wouldn't be surprised that our hives have brood there. So they wouldn't be able to leave that brood alone. So they have to contract around it, which means they've got less access to all that honey around the comb. So for 2 days, starvation, in my view, is not going to be a worry. If this lasted for a week and they're eating a lot of extra honey to keep warm, then it can become an issue. When the cold in the 20s lasts for a further 2 or 3 weeks, then starvation becomes a real issue because they're still locked in place, but they can't get to the honey resources that they need. This week, it's going to be different. It's going to be a sudden, brutal blast of cold. And so I'm not too worried about them starving over a 2 or 3 day period. What I'm worried about is the heat being whipped away from the hive because of the winds in 20, 30 miles an hour and that extreme cold. That's what kills the bees. You don't have to be in a blast freezer for very long. In fact, the weather forecasters tell you if you're going to be out for more than 5 minutes, you can get frostbite in 5 minutes under those conditions. The bees have a much bigger surface area to volume ratio. They're going to die very, very quickly in extreme cold. And that's where insulation really, really pays off. We've only had 2 instances this year where the insulation, I feel, was absolutely necessary to prevent a hive suffering some of the consequences. Normally in Maine, we can cope without insulation in most circumstances, but there's 2 occasions. This week is going to be one, and about a month ago, we had the other situation which happens where insulation really pays off. And that was when the temperatures went from about 45, 50 degrees during the daytime, the sun set, and the temperature dropped like a rock, and it was down to 10 degrees in a matter of 3 hours. When that happens, the bees that were warm and moving around and flying that afternoon cannot get back to a cluster sufficiently quickly in order to keep warm. And what happens is, instead of getting back into a basketball-sized cluster, they end up with 10 tennis ball-sized clusters and a softball-sized cluster in the middle. Because they literally couldn't get from the corners of the hive, because they chilled so quickly, they couldn't get from the rest of the hive into the middle. And so those little tennis ball cluster sizes were not warm enough to individually keep warm. They froze to death. The cluster in the middle may have lived for another day or two, but 2 or 3 more nights of cold, and they were finished off too, because they're trying to keep a whole hive warm. You know, we've lost too much of the cluster to survive the cold. Insulation avoids that problem. Yes, in many cases, if you've got a really big cluster, you've not got an issue. But if you've got a moderately sized cluster or a small cluster in the first place, they don't survive that sort of sudden loss of bees. This week, we're going to have the other instance where the temperature just drops away too quickly, and no matter, even though they've got a decent sized cluster, if the hive is not insulated adequately and is exposed to wind, the heat's getting whipped away continuously, and the bees literally freeze. The bees on the outside of the cluster start dying, and then further and further, and they can't generate heat, and further becomes an issue. And we end up with perhaps a small cluster, with it being a relatively short, maybe the center of the cluster survives, but now it's going to not be big enough to survive the next cold spell. And so that's how we lose bees from the brutal cold. The insulation stops the loss of that heat, and hence the cluster can take care of it. Bees cope very well with the cold, but they struggle with the sudden changes of cold, or losing that heat too quickly, or losing it too intensely, like with being a blast freezer from the wind. So what can we do to prevent that? Obviously, you'll know I use bee cozies, which are the equivalent of almost a couple of inches of insulation around the hive. The cozy, being plastic, also acts like an excellent windbreak in its own right. But if we can protect them from wind with pallet fencing or a little wind fencing or trees, wonderful. That really, really helps. The cozies themselves act like a very good windbreak and very good insulation. I've got no worries about my bees that are reasonably sheltered from the wind. They have cozies on, they've got upper insulation on the roof. I'm not worried about this cold for myself. This video is for those who don't have that luxury. So a lot of folks go through the winter with the confidence in something like tar paper, which will be helpful on a sunny day, but it does not help the loss of heat from the hive at all. And as I say, most winters, that's adequate. We don't have the circumstances which cause them to die. But this week, we're going to have those circumstances where it can happen. So if you can, go out there with a little bit of insulation of some form or other. You may not have time to get a cozy, but you can, if you have some scraps of polystyrene, foam board, go and staple them to the hive, pin them to the hive. If you've got some bubble wrap, wrap the bubble wrap around the hive. All we need to do is to retain that heat long enough that the bees can, and sufficiently that the bees can cope. If we can shelter them from the wind, great. Do not move your hives. Don't open them up. It's not starvation that's going to be an issue. Don't worry about feeding them right now. The important thing is just to try and help them keep a bit warmer if you can do. As I say, if your hives are reasonably well prepared, this is not going to be a worry. But for those of you who maybe didn't have the time to do it, try to do it if you can, because you might be able to prevent the loss of a hive. As you probably know, we've been very busy, Amy and myself, with our Beekeeping 24/7, and we've done a beekeeping, sort of a beginner's beekeeping workshop, which went extremely well. We had a couple of 100 people participate in that, and that was very exciting. So people from all over the country, from Alaska to California to Florida, as I say, over a couple of 100 people joined us for that. It was really, really good, and we got a great deal of excitement out of it. And I think we helped a lot of people get a taste for what's involved in beekeeping. And a good number of those people have been joining us in Beekeeping 24/7 as we opened up the doors to new members. But in fact, we've had the doors open for the last 5 or 6 days, and the doors closed tonight. So we have had the doors closed for new members since April. We've opened them up this week. If you're interested in joining Beekeeping 24/7 for the online mentoring and the classes that we do, and the membership of the group, which is very educational, follow the link below in the description below. I'll put it down there. You've got until midnight tonight Eastern time to see if that's something. You can click on the link and it will tell you a lot more about Beekeeping 24/7. If that's something of interest, we'd very much like to see you. I'm Peter Cowan, the Bee Whisperer. See you next time.